Life for All presents Daily Food Series, The Gospel of John, Word, Life, and Edification. Part 2. Title of Book 6, Resurrection, A New Day, A New Beginning, by Pedro. Week 1. Jesus is unjustly arrested and judged. Friday. Jesus is interrogated by the Jewish leaders. Read with prayer. The next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." John chapter 1, verse 29. Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, and soon after, his trial began, carried out by the Jewish authorities based on the law of Moses. Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now, it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. John chapter 18, verses 12 through 14. During his ministry, John the Baptist had presented Jesus as the Lamb of God. John chapter 1, verse 29. That is why Jesus, at his last Passover supper, foretold to his disciples that he would be sacrificed as the Passover lamb of that year. In the Old Testament, according to the law of Moses, the Passover lamb had to be examined, as it could not have any defect. Exodus chapter 12, verses 3 through 6. This highlights that because Jesus was a Passover lamb, the priest had to examine him. Jesus was examined by the high priest and the Roman governor, and no defect was found in him, so that the scriptures might be fulfilled. If Caiaphas was the high priest, why did they lead Jesus first to Annas, Caiaphas' father-in-law? Annas was the high priest from the year 6 to the year 15 A.D., and continued to exert great influence even after leaving office. In fact, he was the patriarch of the family of the high priest, so he had great power. In order for a priest not to acquire too much influence, the Roman government forced them to exercise their role only for a certain period, and then passing it on to another. This is what happened to Annas, who had great influence among the Jewish people. 5 of his sons had already held the role, and now it was his son-in-law, Caiaphas' turn. Many considered Annas the high priest and legitimate holder of the position, even though Caiaphas had replaced him at the time of Jesus' trial. After Jesus' arrest, according to the Gospel of John, there is a record of Peter denying the Lord, and Simon Peter followed him, and so did another disciple. Now, that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl, who kept the door, said to Peter, "You're not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and the officers, who had made a fire of coals, stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. John chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. He who said he would never abandon Jesus, even if others did, ended up denying him. The other disciple mentioned was most likely John. Jesus entered the courtyard of the high priest's house, and John, having been known to the high priest, was allowed to enter as well. Peter did not have this privilege, but John spoke to the person in charge of the door and took Peter inside. Then Jesus was questioned by Annas. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always met. And in secret I have done nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the soldiers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. And if well, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. John chapter 18, verses 19 through 24. Annas asked Jesus about his disciples and what he taught. And he told them that his teaching was public. Everyone heard him and said there was nothing to hide. Then one of the guards slapped Jesus. And Annas, realizing that the interrogation would not clarify anything, since everyone knew what Jesus taught, sent him to Caiaphas. Write the sentence that touched your heart the most. Highlight the key points in this sentence. Pray according to the content highlighted above.